one name comes to mind when we sing that song, right? Dear Saint Frederick. There are many attacks on the Bible today in so many ways and comes in many forms and shapes. But one of it is saying is that the Bible is corrupted. The biblical text has been tampered with. But let me just say this. One of the reasons why I believe that the Bible wasn't tampered with, or that the text was corrupted, and that is why the Bible continues to be believable, credible, and trustworthy, is because of this verse. Are we on, Andrew? Interesting. Okay. There you go. Thank you, Andrew. This is the verse I was talking about. That is the reason. Okay. There you go. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, were not killed with those who were disobedient. Okay. Rahab, or Rahab in the Hebrew. This is also one of the reasons I keep saying that. But one of the reasons why I like the newer translations in English is because of the usage of the words. If you have an older English translation, you would read the word harlot. But honestly, seriously, do we hear that word often today, harlot? But prostitute, yes. Hooker probably would be much more understandable. And so she is mentioned here as a prostitute, Rahab. Now, if any one of us thinks that this is easy under the eyes, this is not easy on the eyes to read. Imagine a prostitute being commended for her faith. Because this is just simply scandalous. Because this is just simply something that, being disgraceful. A number of rabbis, these are the Hebrew teachers and some Bible teachers, wanted to whitewash her personality. In fact, if you're familiar with Flavius Josephus, is the first century Jewish historian, tried to paint her as an innkeeper, not really as a prostitute, maybe someone who keeps an inn. She was a hostess. And even much more recently, in the magazine Biblical Archaeological Review that came out in 2013, September-October review, gave her or painted her in a better light. Now, over against those who try to, whitewash the character of Rahab and trying to say that, she was not really a prostitute. I'd like to quote Abraham Kuyper, who said these words. He said this, "How then some have incredulously wondered, could such a woman that is Rahab have been a harlot? How could she have been a wanton woman who yielded indiscriminately to every man who chanced to cross her threshold? Why, it was altogether too disgraceful to believe, especially to those smug and self-satisfied burghers who, and by the way, like me, who is not a native English speaker, burghers, I believe, are the citizenry, the citizens, oi polloi, as who with a holier than thou art attitude look down with disdain upon those such flagrant sinners. And of course, the thought was especially repulsive to those who cultivated the habit of regarding all scriptural characters as models of piety, to those, in other words, who base their excellence and salvation upon virtuous living. Thus, they guessed and speculated because they did not understand God's counsel for the redemption of sinners. They distorted the story of Rahab because they wanted to set up a scheme of salvation based upon human goodness. It is really revolting just to read a character named Rahab, a prostitute, being named as one of the heroes of the faith. Yet, and this is my reason why I believe the Bible has never been corrupted at all. Yet there was no attempt on the part of the Bible to hide her dark past. The word prostitute was not deleted in the textual copies. In fact, the best proof of this is when the Greek writers interpreted the Hebrew word zunah, and they used the word porne, sexual immorality, porneo, to fornicate, sounds like pornos, the man, porneo, pornography. They all come from the same word. Porne is the word for Rahab, the prostitute. So there was no attempt to deny the fact that she was a prostitute. This is supposedly, now take note, this is supposedly the eulogy of the Bible that the Bible gives to Rahab. So just try to imagine. We're sitting in the funeral service of Rahab, and this is what the Word of God says about her. By faith, Rahab the, you know about her. By faith, Rahab, because she welcomed, no. By faith, Rahab the prostitute. There's no hiding it. So, but then it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there. Because it becomes even increasingly embarrassing to the sensibilities of the refinement of a goody-goody, smug mentality to know that the same Rahab would eventually become the great-great-grandmother of a very important person in our salvation history, whose name is David. Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was, that's the woman we're looking at. Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So, I guess we are now getting the message. The clear message here is that this list of heroes of the faith were but ordinary, sinful men and women. God did not give them faith because they were extraordinary. They were extraordinary because God gave them faith. We always have that kind of a thinking, oh, that person is nice. Oh, that person is good. That person is very polite. And then we come to the conclusion that because of their politeness, their niceness, God saves them. No. God saves those who are sinful, prostitutes, murderers, liars, like who we are. God lifts up those who are sinners and brings down those who have a sense of self-righteousness. And so such is Rahab, a sinful, condemnable, immoral woman who slept with different men who were not her husband. Yet God elevated her and gave her a special place in the Bible in the plan of salvation because of her faith. So, a couple of questions in our study today on Rahab. One of the two women that mentioned as in the heroes of the faith. One question is this: what were the outstanding characteristics of her faith? The second question is, of course, what can we learn from her faith? So the very first thing I believe that sets her apart in terms of her faith is this. Now, we know where Rahab was living in. She was living in Jericho. She was living on the walls of Jericho. And we know the story of Jericho. The children's Sunday school, you have a song about the walls of Jericho falling down and things like that. So you're familiar with this. So Rahab was commended for her faith. So what is it about her faith that sets her apart and became an example in Hebrews chapter 11? Well, the first thing that we can look at in her faith is that she categorically took the side of God. Oh, well, that sounds like ordinary, but let's look at how it is expressed. Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. Basically, these verses is a confession of faith. The confession of faith of Rahab, that which describes why her faith was exceptional. So we read, I know the Lord has given you this land. She's not talking to the two spies that Joshua sent out to scout the whole place. She told them, we are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings, east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has courage to fight about after hearing such things, for the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. Now let's try to unpack this a little bit. So how can we understand the faith of Rahab? We can better understand the faith of Rahab if we put it in contrast with what was going on with her people. So we are looking at this part of the story at the moment when Rahab was in Jericho and she was a Jerican, together with all of the Jericans who live in Jericho. So one thing that we could observe here is this. In her confession, everyone else denied the plan of God for God's people. Now, just try to look at this. Know that the Lord has given you. Now, that's not just an easy statement to stop or to say for someone living in Jericho. He's saying, you people coming out of Egypt are coming here to take our land. You are coming here to take our land, and you will not even pay for it. And you will not even pay for it. You will take even our silver and our gold and all our jewels. And if we don't give it to you, you will kill all of us. Basically, that's the whole story. And for her to say, I know the Lord has given you this land. Wow. How could she ever say that? Come, take what is ours. It's yours. Don't pay for the real estate you're using. And not only that, you get all my wealth. So everyone didn't go along with the plan of God. But you see, Rahab was looking at what's going on as a plan of God. Now, this is not your own ideas, I know, because God is behind you in doing this. And she admitted that. The second thing also is that while everyone disregarded the display of God's power, Rahab was convicted. Now, today, as in the old, any rumor or gossip or story, they spread around rather quickly. The story of this band of people coming out of slavery of the nation of Egypt, and their God split open a dry pathway across the Red Sea, and they crossed all of them safely to the other side. That story was, wow, it wasn't just a gossip. So the story was circulating around the area. Everybody knows who the Hebrews are. Oh, the Hebrews, their God is a great God. And yet we see that Rahab regarded the display of God's power, while the rest disregarded the display of God's power. Feared with, but the fear of Rahab was the fear of reverence and awe. While everybody else, they resist God, we see Rahab confessing this. She confessed this. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. Now, she was a Canaanite. She wasn't brought up in the Mosaic law. She has no idea what the Torah was. She doesn't know the Ten Commandments. She doesn't know. She is completely clueless about God's ways through his people, the Hebrews, and yet for her saying this is stick. So she said, she confessed that the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens and the earth below. And while everyone was prepared to take a stand, they know the armies of Israel was already up. They can see them from the top of the towers of Jericho. Yet we see that Rahab accepted the fact that the God of the Hebrews, God, and that he has to fulfill the plan of occupying the promised land. And so Rahab, her faith unsolved. Joshua said, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. You see, in the warfare, if an approaching army is superior in power, and that the defending city finds itself that no match for the firepower, there's a conditioned warfare, so to speak, that they declare themselves to be an open city. Like in the World War, Second World War, Manila was declared an open city. Don't bomb us anymore. No more fighting in this place. We give up. We raise the white flag. So to minimize additional destruction and casualty. Now, Jericho could have said something like this, together with Rahab, that your God is a supreme God, and your God's plan has to come to pass, and we should cooperate with you. And so we will declare Jericho to be an open city. No more bloodshed, no more warfare. We can walk out quietly and peacefully, and you can take over our land, take over our wealth, and then we'll go find our place across the river Jordan, because this is a place, the promised land that's been given to you by your God, and we agree with you on that 100%. They could have. And so Rahab said, you promised me, she was talking to the two spies, that this thing is inevitable. Your God will destroy us, but please spare my life, my family's life. And that happened actually. And so we see that was commended even by James. Next slide, please. That's why James, to Rahab the prostitute, is another example. She was shown to be right with God, but he had messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. So, what was it that she gave? Well, her entire life, her people, her religion, her culture, her loyalty, and everything. That's why Joshua kept his promise. And the promise is we see in Joshua chapter 6, verse 25. Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her family, and who belonged to her, because she hid the man Joshua and sent as spies to Jericho. Now, take note of the last sentence, or the last phrase. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Well, of course, what that means is when the writer was writing this, He was referring to the time of his writing. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, supposing after the destruction of Jericho and after Rahab and her family were saved, she changed her mind and said, oh, okay, I probably mind my own business, go on my own way. Remember, she was a Canaanite. And as a Canaanite, she had kinship with many villages around Jericho. And she could easily move over to that place and start her life all over again. And yet we see she decided to stay with the Israelites. And we know that story now. She got married to Salmon. Salmon with Rahab gave birth to Boaz. Boaz to Obed. Obed to Jesse. And Jesse gave birth to King David. And so we see that Rahab's faith was exceptional. She took the side of God between her people, between her whole life. She decided 100% to go with God's plan. Now, of course, we cannot escape the fact, and central to the story of Rahab is this. She was caught between the devil and the deep blue sea because she was confronted with a real dilemma. A real dilemma is when we are presented with two equal, ethical demand, and we only have to choose one. And we know what that was to Rahab. Rahab was caught between one, telling the truth. When the men of the king of Jericho came over to search out the two spies, Rahab, bring them out. We know that. So Rahab needs to be truthful, or she has to preserve the lives of these two men. Now, that's not easy. And I know it's not easy for any of us to be put in such a situation. That's why, because of this dilemma, because of this conflicting demand to do the right thing, I guess this whole matter falls within the purview of ethics. We cannot escape ethics. So we have what we call a qualified ethical dilemma. Now, let me just say this. Ethical dilemmas mean that we are confronted with two ethical decisions, but we can only make one. Sometimes there are false dilemmas, which are not, limited to just two choices. Maybe there are three or more. But in Rahab, what we can see here is a true ethical dilemma. Now, let me just run you through a quick survey of what ethics is. Now, ethics has something to do with what we ought to do, the right thing we ought to do. That's the concern of ethics. So the concern of ethics is determining what is morally right and morally wrong. Ethics is inescapable. It is inescapable and very necessary, because the first thing is that we are created an orderly universe. We have been created an orderly universe, and we have a moral God, and we have been created in His image as moral beings. And that every action, there must be a consequence. And so we cannot avoid talking about ethics, because we are moral beings. So, and in fact, there are many applications in medicine, in medical ethics, in business ethics, in political ethics. Oops, why do I have to say that? It doesn't seem right. Is there any ethics at all in politics? But anyway, the whole point is that in every area of our human lives, we, whether we are aware of it or not, we actually practice ethics or not. So let me just walk you through very quickly through the world of ethics so we can understand Rahab. Now, this is not to say that Rahab actually went through all this process. I just want us to walk through this so that we can have a bird's eye view of what we're looking at in terms of Rahab's fate. So bear with me for the next few minutes when I do that. So the number one question of ethics is this: are there fixed or universal norms? What that means is that, is there a bar up there, or maybe a little bit down, whatever where the bar is, but is there a bar or a standard over which all of us have to follow in order to do that which we ought to do, morally wrong or morally right? Now, there are two major divisions depending on the answer to this question. Are there absolute norms, meaning they don't change in time, they don't change across culture, they don't change anywhere around the world, it remains constant? So there are those who said that there are no absolute norms. So on those who say that there are no absolute norms, this is what we call the non-absolutism or relativism. I know this can give us a headache when we get to those isms, but I can help you with this after the service, or maybe later I can share to you my notes. And I am indebted to the book by Dr. Norman Geisler, Ethics, Alternatives, and Issues. And I base a lot of these things that I constructed here, but I modified it a little bit just to make it more understandable. So, those who say there are no absolute norms, they're just relative. So, in the non-absolutism, relativism side or the school of thought, there are three major, or of course, yes. Those who say that there are absolute norms is the position called absolutism, meaning there are universal norms that are unchangeable, that are fixed, they are standard, and they always determine what is right and what is wrong. So let's look at non-absolutism. There are three major schools of thought. One is antinomianism, and now hold up. Let me spend more time here. Okay, what is antinomianism? Now, the word anti actually is meant against, but this is not about a position that is against the law, but rather a position that says there are no laws, there are no norms, there are no bars. But actually, in reality, technically speaking, the position of antinomianism actually have norms. The only difference is that these norms are relative to the perspective of the individual. So there are no absolute norms in that sense. The norms or standards are relative to the individual standard or perspective. So in the matter of is lying right or wrong, from the antinomian point of view, lying is neither right nor wrong, depending upon the perspective of the individual. So this is similar to what was happening in the book of Judges, when every man was doing right in his own eyes. That is antinomianism. And like I said, it's a misnomer because it's not a denial of any existence of any norm at all, but the norm is the perspective of the individual. So lying can be right or wrong depending upon the assessment of the perspective of the individual. The second form of non-absolutism is called generalism. What this means is that there are no universal norms, but there are general norms. What that means is that there is a general rule in understanding that lying is indeed wrong, but there is always an exception to the rule. What that means is that not every situation, that norm is a determinant for what is morally right or wrong, but rather anything can be acceptably be morally right or wrong on the basis of what is the exception. So again, this is very shifty because who determines what is the exception? Again, a good example of this would be utilitarianism, altruism, because the exception to the rule is this. If that would result, that's why, if antinomianism is relative to the perspective of the individual, generalism is relative to the ends, meaning to say, will it result in a greater good or greater benefit? So if it will result to the greater benefit, it becomes utilitarianism. So going back again to Rahab, supposing she lied, she is not accountable for that lying. It becomes true because it is an exception to the rule. Because I'm not saying that's the way we look at it. I'm just using this as an example. Because the exception to the rule is that it is for the greater benefit of the people of God. Or altruism, called summum bonum, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And by the way, in case you will be wondering, where are all this stuff applied into our lives? Just lately, this has been an ethical discussion about the driverless cars with just simply passengers sitting in the car. There's been an ethical debate that actually stumped Google from doing their own version of the self-driving car, because the ethical question was posed to the designers and the software makers. What if there's an accidental situation and it will involve loss of life? So what will be the ethical decision to program the software to when there's a choice between killing one person and many? So the program was, of course, basing on this ethical construct. Altruism or summum bonum is to preserve the many and kill the one person, and they were stumped. What does it mean? If I'm a passenger in the car and the car is out of control and I have no control over it, it will decide to kill myself so that it will save many. And so they stopped. Again, I can go on and on about ethical discussions in medicine and politics and business, but the point is that we have to be aware that this is the ethical construct out there, and to be aware what the scripture tells us, because the scripture tells us a biblical ethical view. So the next is situationism. Situationism, Joseph Fletcher is the main author of this. He says this, that the right or wrong is determined by one universal ethic. Sometimes situationism is referred to as the love ethic, meaning to say it is there. Again, this is a misnomer. While on the one hand we classify situationism among the non-absolutism, and to accept that there's a one universal ethic seems to be in the absolutism. Actually, the universal there is just not in the same way we should understand here. And if I'm confusing you, I'm a little bit confused myself, but it's okay. Remember the story about this patient who was to have an open heart surgery, and it was his first time. And of course, he was scared, he was nervous, and so at the operating table, before they administered anesthesia, or that which puts you to sleep, are you okay? And then the patient said, "Doc, I'm really nervous." And the doctor assuringly smiled back at him and said, "Don't worry. If it's your first time, it's also my first time." So, okay, anyway, just to, perk up the production of endorphins in our brains. Let's go back to our discussion. More confusion. Anyways, so situationism is this. It says that what is the loving way to do in any situation is the right thing. Of course, there's a little bit of biblical truth to it, but it's not the way it is. So what that means is this. Everything else, any moral duty, if it is the loving thing to do, then that's the correct one. So you can disobey, for example, the vow of matrimony or the vow of marriage if the love is lost, if you're falling out of love, and there's no sin involved like adultery. And this is the kind of approach of psychologists, by the way. This is the normal way. And unfortunately, very sadly, some pastors are buying into this thing, that in order for the partner to be happy, they would say the love ethic, the situation demands that your happiness is number one. So even if you disobey God in denying the indivisibility of the marriage union, it's okay. That is situationism. That is situationism. So it is always relative to perspective, relative to the ends. Actually, another name for this is the ends justify the means. And relative to circumstances, ethics changes when circumstances changes. Okay. We will get to that part where my bias is. Of course, on the other side, it's absolutism. Now, yes, this is a description of, yeah, that's right. This is a description of Norman Geisler of situationism. For nothing but the absolute norm of love makes an act morally right, and nothing but the lack of love makes an act morally wrong. And why do I say that? In a sense, yes, it may sound biblical, but on the other hand, it is not, because who determines what's the loving way? The person. The person. It's like our law of harassment. Our Canadian law on harassment is very shaky, because how do you define harassment? Well, there's that one word that determines whether you are harassing me or not. If I feel it unwelcome. So if a woman welcomes the groping hand of a person, that's not harassment. But if it is unwelcome, that's harassment. So again, this is what I'm saying. These are man-made laws, and we must be aware. We must be up on our toes about what's going on, because this can, sweep us away like a rushing flood, and before we know it, we've been caught in a big lie. But anyways, let's go back to the illustration. So in the side of absolutism, and thank you, by the way, for bearing with me. This is just how I am. When I explain and I'm excited, sometimes I confuse people. Anyway, so in absolutism, there are two main branches. One would be meritorious absolutism. I'll explain that in a little bit. And then believing absolutism. What that means is that absolutism holds that there are standards. That bar stays there. That bar is fixed. We cannot lower it down. We cannot explain it away, give it another meaning, or maybe suspend it sometimes in instances in which it doesn't apply. What is wrong is wrong. What is right is right. That is what is absolutism. It's universal. It applies to all. So lying in Asia would be wrong as in lying in North America. That's what it means. So this is absolutism. Now the difference is that in meritorious absolutism is that we can be strict to the rules, the norms and standards just by obligatory compliance. That's legalism. Legalism is, while it holds on to absolutism, the motivation is because it will, merit something. It will earn something, like acceptance from God. But then on the other side is what is called believing absolutism. And let me just say this right now, that historic Christianity, the majority of historic Christianity in history have stood upon believing absolutism. We accept that there are universal norms. They are standards, constants, and fixed. What is right is right. What is wrong is wrong. Otherwise, our only other choice would be this side, but even this side accepts what is moral right and moral wrong, depending relative to their understanding. So we cannot really escape the fact that ethics is part of our life. So there are three schools of thought on believing absolutism. Andrew? Non-conflicting, ideal, and hierarchical. Now let me explain each one at a time. So non-conflicting absolutism says that there are really no conflicting situations. God will not put us in a situation where our choices are the devil and the deep blue sea. And there's a verse to it, God will not tempt us beyond what we are capable of. So morally wrong or wrong, morally right or right, but then the apparent conflict between the ethical norms is only apparent, and there are no conflict of duty. In fact, there could always be what we call a third option. So going back to the story of Rahab, they would probably say that, oh, Rahab could have chosen to remain silent. So in keeping silent, she wouldn't lie. And in keeping silent, she wouldn't give away too much information to those who were running after the two spies. And so the two spies will be saved from their lives. So the ideal absolutism, and by the way, ideal absolutism and non-conflicting absolutism, there are many writers on this work. Ian Murray, Jay Adams, and many others as well. The ideal absolutism says that there are duties sometimes that are conflicting, and when that happens, the way to resolve this is just simply to commit the lesser evil, and then you will get pardoned for your failure to obey the other ethical demand. So between telling the truth and saving a life, the choice of Rahab was to save the life, but she violated the rule of telling the truth. So she has been forgiven for doing that because she obeyed preserving the rule, the other rule of preserving life. So it comes down to hierarchical, which I don't hide my bias on this because I see that this is what the Bible is showing to us. Number one. Oh, anyways. So the dividing line between this side of the ethical world and this side of the ethical world is that this side, man is the norm. The individual determines the morality and the ethical standards. Here, James chapter 4, verse 12, there's only one lawgiver. So any Christian who denies that should make a choice. Now, if you're saying, well, I'm not in anything of this, well, that's something I cannot really deal with right now, and I won't be able to explain that. But the point here is this. There's one lawgiver. That one lawgiver is the standard of righteousness. And that is best expressed in the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments has not been changed. It's not been varied. It's not been modified. Or even, abrogated. It stays there. Adultery is adultery in the Ten Commandments, even until now. And so on and so forth. And we see that in Jesus Christ himself, he gives us a picture of how these different norms are arranged in terms of importance or value. A good example would be Matthew 23, verse 23. So, if you will just read, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of law." Now, I want us to take note of this. More important. What does it tell me? It's in the comparative degree. What it tells me is that there are important things, There are more important things. So there is a sense of degree. There is the part of the law which is more important, which is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Yet Jesus says this, you should have practiced the later without neglecting the former. Jesus doesn't abrogate anything. He's saying that the law on sacrifice or worship is of lesser importance. So here we see that there is a hierarchy of values. Another is Acts chapter 5, verse 29 to 30. We know this. Peter and the apostles were told, stop talking about your Jesus Christ and stop evangelizing. And so the Sanhedrin said, don't do that or else you get in trouble. But Peter said, and the apostles, we must obey God rather than men. Now, who were the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin was the same authority that Paul, when he was slapped in the face, backtracked and said, oh, I didn't know that I was speaking to the ruler of the people. There was a sense that there is a rule there, an authority, but yet we see that between the authority of God and man, we see that there is a hierarchy. Another, if we go to the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, the Hebrews were accustomed to looking at the Decalogue in two tablets. The first tablet, which is the set of commandments, the first greatest commandment, loving to God, is expressed in the first tablet. Loving of neighbor is expressed in the second tablet. Now, the second tablet follows after the first tablet. That's how the Hebrews thought of their greatest commandments. So we see, again, there is a hierarchical order. So let me just give you what that means. The hierarchy of values, if we look at it in terms of a pyramidal structure, at the very topmost is that God. Everything about God. His interests, His plans, His wishes, His will, His purposes. And then down below would be the sanctity of life. That's a duty for us. The command not to murder is a command to preserve life. Sanctity of the truth. And the stewardship of property. So between the loss of property and telling the truth, of course, we have to tell the truth. Where's your money? Money is unimportant. You say the truth and you lose your property. And same thing, like running after a robber. I would say that this is one of the things that the policemen should be trained. Don't shoot them. Don't kill robbers, because between life and property, life is more important. Catch them alive, basically. And I'm saying ethical principles is a fantastic, exciting world to study because it affects our living and life. And if we don't have a proper grounding on the Word of God, starting with the lawgiver, then we will go awry in terms of our understanding of what's right or wrong, and we become our own moral standard. But this is why we're studying Rahab, because in Rahab we see that although Rahab doesn't probably know all of these isms, but in Rahab we see that she followed this structure. To her, the highest duty that she has to fulfill and to obey is God. To her, life was more important over the truth. That's why she has to preserve by all means the two spies. But then we're not just talking here of two lives, the spies. We're talking here of the life of the nation of Israel. So Rahab was not just looking at the two lives, but the life of a nation. And Rahab was not only looking at the life of a nation from which the Messiah will come, but she was putting God over, above everything else. Now, let's just give that list. Next slide, please. The greatest ethical ought to do, God's plan, God's wishes, God's will, God's agenda, God's interests, God's purposes, God's work. All of this takes number one position in our lives. What that means is that is the most important thing for a Christian, and everything else falls a far distant second. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. For the next and last 10 minutes, let me just share with you a couple of points by way of application on the basis of understanding the faith of Rahab. Is this. My question is, what is it that counts as the most important thing to you in your life? Now, if you're a believer, we only have to have one answer. And that answer is the same answer as Rahab. As a believer, that which take precedence and priority in my life is God's work of salvation. And where is that demonstrated? In the gathering of his people into the church. The church is the visible manifestation of God's wishes, God's interests, God's purposes. And God's work, it must take precedence over everything else. Because let me tell you, when we're all gone, this old earth and old heaven will be gone. We're all dead. There will be only one church, the bride of Christ. And so we ask the question, and if it is that very important to God, the work of the gospel, the work of salvation is so important to God, then the next, logical answer or statement would be, then that would be what will be the most important thing to me. So, I have many examples, but some of the examples that come to mind to me something like this. There are times in which, while we do subscribe to the fact that, yes, I perfectly, 100% agree with you on that, Pastor. But sometimes, unknowingly, there are situations in which we probably are not aware of, but what comes in the way of fulfilling God first, it could be individual comfort. It could be individual pleasure. It could be individual achievements. Now, if we compare this with the things of God, this is really very tiny. An example, towards his crucifixion, Jesus started talking plainly to his disciples that he's going to die. He didn't tell them that he's going to die in his first year of ministry, second year of ministry, even in his third year of ministry, in the first half, but toward the end of the third year of Jesus' ministry, Jesus started to talk plainly to his disciples. You know what, Peter and my disciples, I'm going to die. Now we pick up the story. Let's try to see what happened there. So the story goes like something like this in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 21. So from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day will be raised to life. How did Peter react? Probably the reaction of Peter was very same way with the disciples reacted. This was the reaction of Peter. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 22. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Let's pause for a few moments there and try to digest what that means. Jesus said, I'm getting killed, Peter. And Peter said, no way, man. We will defend you. We will not let you be killed. Your comfort and convenience and life is very important. So probably he was also thinking of scoring points with his master. He wants to defend Jesus. Jesus, you're not going to die. So what was going on there? Well, I guess what was happening there was Peter was only concerned of the welfare of Jesus. Let's go to the next verse. What did Jesus respond to Peter? Peter said, now he did not address Peter as Peter. He addressed Satan. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. What was the thing of God that was more important than life itself? the mission of Jesus to save sinners. And if Peter frustrated Jesus from doing that, he could have saved him, Jesus wouldn't have died, and we don't have any reason at all to be here if Jesus didn't die. Do you see the kind of ethical, processing that is going on? The same thing. And let me say this. I'm not saying this out of any kind of spirit, but let me just correct that whole thinking that the church should serve at the pleasure of the members. Okay, let me break it down. What that means is this. I've heard this story many times before. I come into a church, and at church, I'm no longer happy in the church I go. What's going on? What is the most important thing that is going on there? The personal satisfaction of the individual. Because if you are and we are true Christians, whatever work is that, even if that work is gasping for air, it's still a valid and legitimate work of God. And I must say, the work of God takes precedence. We are here to serve God and to push the agenda of God's work, because God's work is there up there. Unless, of course, our opinion about God's work is different. Another example. In order to preserve the ego of an individual, the church is willing to divide just to please that individual instead of administering discipline, which is the more obedient way to do. And I'm not just, pulling this out from nowhere. I have lived my Christianity for 39 years to know these things happen. Not only from things I read in books, but situations and circumstances and experience that I've been with. Not exactly the church I've been with, but friends I know of. This happens. So what's going on there? Is the individual who is king? Is the individual who determines who comes in and out of the church? No. I will talk about this more, but we read in Acts chapter 2, and the Lord added to the church those who were being saved. Can anyone just simply, out of the blue, decide, I want to belong to Christ's church? No. Hey, that's not the right way to say that, Pastor. You're discouraging people. No. It is not on an individual's choice to go in and out of church. It's the Lord. Because it's the Lord who adds to the church. And it's the Lord who takes away people out of His church. We are living in an individualistic, egocentric society, and it should change to a God-centered perspective, a God-centered ethic. And we say, we want to be humble. Well, this is one way for us to show humility. Humility is not just keeping silent, by the way, although sometimes it goes along with it. But to be humble is to say, like Rahab, your plan is the plan. I will observe, I will follow, I will submit, I will serve. So whose side are you on? We're living in a very opinionated culture. In a sense, each one of us rarely take a neutral stand on any issue or conversation. In sports, now, if you are a Torontonian, for example, you cannot root for the Capitals. It's a sports crime. You have to take the side of Maple Leafs. If it is true with the sports world, business world, family, how much should it be true with things that are of eternal value? Jesus said this very plainly. He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. Very straightforward. So the last verse I like to share with you in answer to the question, where is our faith then? Now, actually everyone has a faith, by the way. Even atheists, they have a faith. The only difference is that their faith is based on something outside of the Bible and outside of God. I used to be an atheist, so I know what that means. I have my faith in my own self. That's what an atheist is. It doesn't mean no God. The God of an atheist is himself. Luke chapter 5, verse 32. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Let Rahab be an example whenever we have this tendency of feeling that, oh, I'm really nice. Other people are bad. Oh, you know what? I'm entitled to, a little bit of happiness in my life. I can choose to go to church or not. I can choose to believe in God sometimes or not to believe in him. And the final deciding rule would be myself. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Last question, why is it very difficult for unbelievers to believe the gospel? Now, by the way, Ibrahim Ag Muhammad, this book, he mentioned that Muslims are not more difficult to convert than the nice, goody-goody, self-righteous person. Because what that means, are we saying then that God or the Spirit of God needs more power to convert a Muslim than a non-Muslim? No. The heart of a sinner is equally depraved before God and receives the same power to change the heart. And let me tell you, seeing myself going to hell before I became a Christian, I know I was worse than a Muslim. I was worse than a terrorist. Let me be honest with you on that. But again, wonder of all wonders, grace of all graces, God can change sinners. God changed Rahab so that Rahab could live for God and to God and everything to God alone. Anyways, where do you stand now? Where is your faith? Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the example of Rahab. We thank you that she shows to us the plain and straightforward faith of putting you ahead of everything and all considerations. But Lord, we also pray that may you not put us in such a fix or such a bind where we will be faced with choosing between one or the other of your laws. Free us from such kind of a temptation. And if ever we are put in such a situation as Rahab, help us always to consider you first, your work, your interest, your purposes, your wishes, your will comes first. And I pray, Lord, even for those who are here who are not sure where they are at, whose side they are on, may it be that today they will take the right side, your side. And so submit to you, obey you, and serve you, and love you. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.